Excuse me. Last time, you remember me talking about my experiences as a child in the Mormon church, growing up as a young man, and even as an adult, struggling with porn, as was my experience, and trying to find solutions and help and healing within my spiritual context and within my society and my family. And what I learned was there was a lot of shame and guilt and fear. There was a lot of condemnation and judgment about porn, about masturbation, even about genitals or sexuality or specific types of sex. I learned late in the church were actually prohibited by leadership decree, even between married couples. And that didn't fulfill me. That didn't make me happy to live that way. Nor did I find solutions for what I felt were my addictions and my problems. And so, spiritual study and journey led me slowly away from my foundation as a youth in Mormonism, and then actually to a divorce and moving on. And really, it wasn't until the divorce when I felt I had permission to explore my sexuality and intimacy. Now, at that point, I talked a little bit last time about having the bar, they get drunk at a bar, one night stand, or meet women in church. I didn't have a third possibility. I didn't understand how to do it. So I Googled how to meet women. And what I found was there was a whole community of people teaching men how to connect to women, how to meet women, how to engage erotically with them. And so I started studying them. And these were the so-called PUAs or pickup artists. And there were various teachers with various teachings about different topics, one of which was day game, how to talk to a woman in public in broad daylight and invite her to give her your telephone number or out for coffee right at that moment. So I was reading about that and studying that. My friend was taking me out salsa dancing, and he was what they called a natural. So he would go into a bar and there would just all women or a group of women would gravitate toward him, and he'd have a little club quite instantly. The guy just had it. He just had it. So he couldn't explain what he did, but what he did was explain to me or show me or demonstrate by how he was able to connect to women. And so I followed, first of all, that PUA track and reading and studying, learning from David D'Angelo, Carlos Zuma, The Game, Neil Strauss. If you read all these things, these are kind of some of my early mentors. At that time, I went and I met a couple guys at a Dan Kennedy event and they were running a big pickup business at that time. And so I studied that and I learned that for a while. And I learned how to start connecting to women, how to talk to them, how to escalate, as they termed it, meaning going from meeting to getting a telephone number to the first kiss to getting into bed. And as I studied this, it took me about 18 months to go from clueless noob, as they call that nowadays, or AFC, average frustrated chump, to being able to feel confident in meeting women, talking to women, knowing how to act to trigger their attraction. Yeah. And then have a woman want to engage sexually. And then I found that I had no clue what to do at that point. I thought there's got to be more to this. I need to understand what to do. I'd kind of put the whole porn thing on the shelf because without the religion, there was no real condemnation of it or reason to worry about it. I was just doing my researches. But I thought, yeah, I don't like what I'm like when I get to bed. I don't know what to do. I have no education. I have no skills. Remember, I just had my one wife, one partner for years, for my entire life, and up to that point. And so I didn't know much about anything. I remember we were so shy at the beginning that I said yes, and then there's this peak of erotic pleasure, and she said, "Is that the word that rhymes with organism?" So we couldn't even say it. We couldn't even say it. Or she couldn't say it. And we didn't know, we didn't have any foundation to talk about any of this. And it was funny because her brother was actually my church leader. If you can talk to anyone in Mormonism, it's your bishop. And that was her brother, who was my brother-in-law. So I wasn't exactly excited to bring him my sex questions and ask him about what I should be doing with his sister. And so anyway, we pretty much felt stuck. After the divorce, I learned these skills and these tools, and then we're good. Now I have many women or several women who are interested in engaging sexually, and the experience doesn't feel like I know what's going on. So I start looking for two things. Number one, I start looking for the non-monogamy world, which I started to be vaguely knowing that this existed. Now, up to that point, I'd just been aware of Mormon polygamy. In fact, one of my friends in college, his mother was in a polygamous relationship, so his father had multiple wives. And I'd gotten to know that that sort of existed. I didn't know much else. And then I noticed in Mormonism, I think at the time there were 100 active LDS women that were single over 30 for every 30 active single men. So in other words, many of these women were simply never going to get married. And it seemed like a great idea to me when I was on my mission. Hey, we should implement that again. We should do the multiple wife thing, and it would solve a lot of problems. Also, I feel attracted to many different people, and I want to explore that. So maybe that's a great idea. However, the higher ups don't like that idea, and they still don't do it, even though some of the breakoffs from Mormonism do indeed engage like that. So all I had was this patriarchal, multiple wives viewpoint of the spiritual multiple partner community. But then I found there was a organization in Germany where I was living at the time called Zentrum für experimentelles Gemeinschaftsgestaltung, which means Center for Experimental Social Structures. Or in other words, that was a big, long, fancy term in order to say we don't have just one sex partner. We're not monogamous. This group connects erotically and sexually to each other. And they lived in Belzig, south of Leipzig. They were having a demonstration weekend where you could go and get to know them, get to know the community. In fact, they funded their community and their commune because of through events that they held there. And this weekend was one of them. And right as I was just about to go up there to start my journey to learn about alternative sexuality, to start getting some education, to find out from people who were on the front lines how it actually worked, I read another ad in the local online classifieds, and it said, "This weekend only, John Hawken, Master Tantra teacher, is coming from England for one weekend only to teach in Dresden," which is where I was living at the time, Dresden, Germany. And so I had both of these, and I called the number about the Tantra workshop and got a very gruff man who barely answered my questions and seemed unhappy to hear from me. But that didn't deter me. I remembered seeing the words Tantra is connected to something about sex, Tantra, Kama Sutra. I remember seeing books in bookstores and these weird positions, and I don't remember exactly what it was, but it seemed to me that Tantra would have something to do with sexuality and sexual instruction. And not knowing anyone else or anywhere else where that was offered, I thought, well, why don't I go to this weekend workshop? And that is probably the most important, or one of the most important decisions of my life that changed the course of everything. So I went to this Tantra workshop, this sacred sexuality workshop, and I arrived, and there were a bunch of people milling around, and there was a man who looked like Buddha sitting at the front. He had a cross between Buddha and Santa Claus. He had a big beard, white beard, and next to him was sitting and he was a big, first of all, belly like this, big white beard, and he was early 60s, I guess, late 50s, early 60s. And next to him, who I found out later she was his partner as well as his assistant, was an absolutely stunning, gorgeous, blonde Czech woman who was 30 years younger or so. And so he began this workshop and he said, Tantra says you are a point of consciousness and a flow of energy. And the masculine principle is consciousness and the feminine principle is energy. And the consciousness directs the flow of the energy. When we have too much energy without enough consciousness, we have chaos. When we have just pure consciousness and no energy, we tend toward death. And so your relationships, and all of the universe is a dance between these masculine and feminine principles of energy and consciousness. And I was enthralled is too light a term. I was inducted, I was pulled in, I was drawn in, I was mesmerized, I was blown away by the words that he was saying. And I thought, this is a lot more than just sex, I can see already. And this is my home, was the second thing I felt. I felt like I found finally the people or the group that I'd been looking for my entire life. In the words of this rotund, wise man sitting up front. And so he guided us through the workshop steps. He guided us through what was happening, and we do very strange things, like we were dancing. I was dancing with a woman, but not dancing like you normally think of it, dancing fingertip to fingertip, and then we'd move faster and faster until we lost the connection, or head to head, like literally head to head. So maintaining contact with our heads the whole time we were dancing and moving, or our elbows. And we did that exercise to experience energy and consciousness, and noticing that if we started moving too much, we'd lose the connection. We'd get into that chaos. And if we just didn't move at all, it could be a very boring connection. And it depended, and we learned how to focus our consciousness to just that specific point that was dancing in the air. And what I began to receive for the first time in my life there, we also did some breath exercises where we were modeling the breath, the energy flow between man and woman. He began to talk about energy. A few years previously, I had studied Reiki and learned a little bit about energy and energy healing, but this went into a completely different level of information, of structure, of focus, of intent as far as energy went than anything I'd ever experienced before. But we began to watch how energy was key to sexuality and how to really have effective, pleasurable, powerful, and then I would later learn transformational, multi-orgasmic, universe-opening sexual experiences that you would learn to channel energy within your own body and between yourself and your partner, and manage that energy and open up to various flows in various places within your body. And your experiences in sex and sexuality would begin to massively, massively transform. And a lot more happened on that weekend that I don't have time to get into here. But the point is, by the end of the weekend, I knew this is it. This is my journey. This is my guru. He didn't ever use that word. He didn't ever put himself out as a guru, but it felt like this is the guy who's going to show me my next steps. And so I basically, a few months later, quit my consulting job, just had my translation business remaining, and I followed him as much as I could to do all of his workshops, all of his training. He offered a 30-day training over the course of a year. I did that. I did some summer events, and the whole list is on my website. I think I was with him over 100 days in total training over the next couple of years, and began to learn all sorts of things about sex and intimacy and sexuality that I wasn't aware of up until that point. I got to learn about Wilhelm Reich and how when we're raised as children that we get a lot of messages about sex and intimacy and sexuality. And some of those messages that I'd internalized, we had a particular exercise that we examined our beliefs. And what came up for me, we summarized our entire beliefs around these topics into a few sentences. And the sentences were, men are, women are, and love is. And for me, the answers that came out are, women are controlling, men are weak, love is painful, and then sex is non-existent. And so these were my deepest subconscious driving rules and laws and principles that were inside me that I had discovered through working with John. And I thought, well, if this is my belief that women are controlling, men are weak, love is painful, and sex is non-existent, well, that explains why my relationship was the way it was. Not simply because my wife wasn't good enough, or I wasn't good enough, or we weren't practicing the right positions, or we didn't know enough, or we weren't sexy enough. No, it was because I had powerful internal beliefs about these things, beliefs that were so deep and ingrained, and yet completely unconscious to me. And so I would manifest these in my external life. I would manifest these beliefs in how my life and my relationships and my sex life went. And because of that, I wasn't having a satisfying time. Even once I learned skills of seduction, skills of pickup, all of these things, I was still running these same programs. So putting these new techniques and skills on top of the old programming in my body and my beliefs just made it worse. The intimacy still wasn't there. The connection still wasn't there. My confidence in my sexuality, my ability to act in a sexual way, to engage erotically, was not given. And I still wasn't feeling connected to myself or my partners. And that's when I figured out how much work there was to do on that whole part of me. And I'm grateful to John because he showed me that our sexuality is a reflection of the intimate complexity of who we are as humans. Our sexuality is a place for everything to come out that we feel about ourselves, our bodies, our minds, our spirits, about the opposite sex, about our own gender. And the confusion or chaos or pain or difficulty that we feel in sexuality, both within our own relationships or the lack of fulfillment, and in the bigger cultural context, is all a result of what we have been taught to believe and what we have ingested, and how we believe around sex and sexuality and connection. And at that point, I learned something very interesting, because when I was in Mormonism, I was talking to even my psychotherapist there and my teachers, and they said something very wise, it seemed at the time, and that was, one of the tests for an insane person is to give them a bucket and ask them, in ancient China or something like that, give them a bucket and ask them to empty a swamp. And if they take the bucket and start emptying the swamp, then they're deemed insane. But if they dig a ditch for the swamp to drain that with the bucket, then they're called sane, deemed sane, right? And I guess the other point is if they pile dirt where the water would be coming into the swamp, that's the other half of it. So what I was told by my therapist was, well, what you need to do, Ryan, is you need to prevent water from coming into the swamp. And I'm like, okay, I'll do that. And basically in Mormonism, the idea of that was avoid all erotic thoughts, avoid all sexy imagery, unless it's about your spouse, or if you're not married, then avoid it, period. Don't think about it. There were even recommendations: tie your hands to the bedpost at night so you're not accidentally touching yourself in your sleep. It went to that level of trying to avoid sex. Kind of like Alcoholics Anonymous, they'd say avoid alcohol. You don't go to bars, you don't hang around people who are drinking, because that's a trigger and it can set you off, and then you'll be back in your spiral of destruction. Well, that was kind of how Mormonism handled sex and pornography and masturbation when I was there. Just avoid it at all costs. Thus, no water comes into the swamp. Well, what I learned through John and my work with him was that the water in the swamp didn't come from the fact that there were pictures of scantily clad women on billboards somewhere that I happened to see. We were in Germany after all, so the standard's a little bit different. But it's in fact, if I was using sex in a way that wasn't working for me, or porn or anything else, then probably there was a big element of distraction around that, connected to my beliefs about myself, my self-worth, women, what's possible in relating, and a lot of emotional shame and guilt and fear that was perhaps unrelated to sexuality, except for a lot of it was directly connected to fear. Because once we are taught that we should feel guilty or ashamed, or because we have sexual feelings or thoughts, then we're constantly trying to repress a part of us. It's like if someone told you it was really bad morally to eat, or that you should only eat vegetables all the time and to eat anything else would be wicked, then, pretty soon you'd be fantasizing about steak, and you'd be feeling guilty about eating it. And so that's what was happening to me. I'd had both some difficulties in my childhood that had provided a lot of emotional pain that didn't have a chance to process. There was shame and guilt and fear about myself, about my sexuality, and about these experiences. And then there were beliefs about what's right and wrong, which reinforced the shame. And this all prevented me from exploring my sexuality in an open, playful way, because really, sexuality, touch, connection, I dream of a world now, looking back in retrospect, where there's non-judgmental, non-shaming, non-guilting, non-blaming ways to explore our connection and our touch and sexuality. So that was a natural, normal part of me, just like eating is, or defecation. And when I accepted that, I felt a huge weight fall off my shoulders. And then the exploration of it, the reason, one reason, there were several keys, but one reason why I was drawn to porn, or at least erotic imagery and content, was there were feelings and emanations and explorations coming from me around the erotic, around sexuality, that I wanted to explore, but I had no context to. I didn't know how to ask for them. I didn't know how to describe them. I didn't know how to talk about them. And so the only place where I could do that is somewhere where someone had put them on a buffet for me to at least visually engage in, or auditorily, which is interesting because there's a lot of judgment about men. They say, well, they just, they're visually stimulated. They like to look at boobs and butts, and that's how things are. And men are, and there's this definite judgment and attack on the shallowness of men and masculinity, like their sexuality is somehow very base and unvaried, unsubtle, differentiated, non-specific, and vacuous. And that is such an insult to men and their sexuality. That's so painful for me to hear and experience, and to feel and to talk to other men who've also experienced the same thing, that it just breaks my heart, because I know sometimes the most erotic thing for me is listening to a woman's voice, listening to the sounds a woman makes, visualizing, fantasizing. And there's so much depth in my personal erotic experience, even when I was limited to the internet, primarily for finding erotic expression. And And then the very question of what kind of porn are you looking at? What interests you? It was fascinating. I found out from David Ley a bit later. We were played this cassette when I was 12 or 14 about how a convicted serial killer was telling a preacher in his office about how he started looking at Playboy magazines. Then he went up to hardcore BDSM materials, and then he started murdering women. And so the implication was if we looked at any erotic image, if we were looking at Victoria's Secret catalogs or Playboy magazines or Sports Illustrated swimsuit issues, eventually we'd end up murdering women because it would be like this drug and it would take more and more stimulation. It would get more and more intense. And that was where it would go. Well, now that we've all been flooded with porn for 15 years, we have worries about security in our world, but it's not really that we've created 150 million serial killer men who are out there murdering women, because the porn has driven them into ever greater frenzies of crazy stuff. In fact, on a political level, there's a lot we can talk about there. It's actually the sex workers who need to worry about people being violent to them. So what David Ley said is, no, actually our porn, and think of yourself and your porn consumption, pretty much stays the same. When I think about what turns me on now, it's pretty much the same thing that turned me on when I was 20. The kind of situations, the kind of narratives, the kind of bodies, it's pretty much the same thing. There hasn't been this gradual staircase toward ever more depraved material. And I know my boundaries. I know when I get to the place where I say, okay, that's too much for me, I'm not interested in that. And then I know, okay, well, I would like this instead. And I'm getting my core erotic theme clearer and clearer as I move forward in my life and as I explore sexuality with myself and others from a standpoint of who am I and what is interesting to me and how do I want to play? How do I want to explore this, instead of God doesn't want me to do this, I need to avoid it, and I need to ask my preacher if I'm making mistakes. Now, the question that some people ask at this point is, but I feel horrible when I use porn. I feel horrible if I masturbate. The interesting thing is, I'm betting you had a spiritual upbringing if that's the case, because what I found also from David Ley, I love his book, The Myth of Porn Addiction, and I can highly recommend it, is that about the same amount of people, no matter their spiritual upbringing, use or view porn or salacious material or erotic content, but those who grew up in a spiritual environment are much more likely, as I was, to identify as porn addicts or identify as sex addicts or identify as something that is fundamentally sick, flawed, broken, to give themselves a diagnosis, or their spouse giving them a diagnosis. One that doesn't exist, by the way, in the DSM-5, which is kind of the big handbook for psychiatrists and psychological professionals around health. It has things like schizophrenia and things like bipolar and manic. All of these things have gone through the DSM in various levels. In fact, homosexuality was considered an aberration by the psychological community and used to be in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, until they removed it in the mid-70s, at which point millions of people were instantly cured from the disease of homosexuality because it ceased being labeled as a disease. And it's interesting that sex addiction and porn addiction hasn't yet been labeled as a disease officially by these bodies. And in fact, they hesitate and don't want to do so because really, when you start talking about addiction, then you have a series of criteria, and the scientific criteria for addiction don't exist. It's all in David's book. That's fine. Go read that, David Ley. And so what we're stuck with and where we're at is a lot of people condemning themselves because of their own experiences, researches, pleasures, desires, which is just completely sad. once I started learning about sex, then I had to learn about something else as I began diving into all this psychological content, and that was relating and relationship. I had to learn how to communicate, to connect to experience someone else, to invite a structure and a way to play. So in the next video, I'm going to talk about using communication and relating skills, what I found was valuable for me, how it helped me in sexuality, in the bedroom, in my relationships, and then some of the stories that I experienced once I began putting the puzzle pieces together in relating and in sexuality. Thanks for watching. This has been Ryan Auroch.